Hi, everyone. So first, I want to thank you all for joining us. As you can see on the slide, my name is Tanya Biggis, and today we are going to take a look at insights for ArcGIS. So before we get started, a couple of housekeeping things. Somewhere on the in the meeting, you should see a question panel. We are going to take a Q&A at the end of the session, so please put your questions in there. Natalie is monitoring those, and we'll work together at the end to get things answered. So this is actually the third in a series of webinars focusing on GIS apps for health. So back in September, some of you may have been on the seminar where Jared talked about mapping and analyzing health equity with GIS apps. That was sort of an overview of a number of different apps. Last month, we did a little bit of a deeper dive into ArcGIS Community Analyst. And just a heads up, if you missed either of those, you can feel free to join up for our meetup group, and the recordings can be made available, or you can find those through that meetup group. So, as I mentioned, today we are doing insights for ArcGIS. That is the third in the series, the second app. Next month, we're going to tie things up with ArcGIS Pro, and then hopefully we should be announcing another set of, or some new seminars shortly thereafter. All right, let's get started. So what is Insights for ArcGIS? It's an analytic technology. So the idea here is you can run analytics directly from your browser, and really the goal is to be able to marry kind of the visualization and visual analytics that we see a lot today with, other traditional analytics, but really to make location inherently part of it. So if you think about why did we bother doing that? I tend to think of there being two ends of a spectrum when it comes to analytics. On one end, you have BI and reporting engines, what some people will call data science tools. On the other end, when it comes to location, you have traditional GIS analysis. But that leaves a really big gap in between. So really where Insights comes in is to be able to try and fill that gap. So the goal is to be able to provide location analytics to those folks who are more comfortable or are really effective in that sort of BI reporting world, and also, to be completely honest, to give the folks who maybe have used ArcGIS Desktop but maybe aren't using it to its utmost, or using just sort of a small fraction of the capabilities, a chance to take a step back and say, is this the right tool, or is there something that I might be more productive with? So when I think about analytics and what I do when I use Insights, it tends to fall into a few different categories. Now, when I started in this whole world of GIS analytics, I was probably going to use a few different applications to do this. If I look at data prep, things like formatting fields, using formulas to generate new fields or to calculate new fields. A lot of times, although I might have done that in ArcGIS Desktop, ArcMap, or ArcGIS Pro, more so Pro now, a lot of times I was going to do that in something like Excel. Move around then to geo-enablement, to geocode, or append demographic variables. Well, yeah, that was going to happen in ArcGIS Desktop. I may have visualized there, but I may have also moved to another technology, maybe one of those BI engines. Statistical analysis, yeah, that's probably for a lot of people going to happen in an R or a SAS or an SPSS. But then you're going to go back to ArcGIS for spatial analysis, and so on and so forth, and all of these different capabilities. The idea is, how can you bring those together? And that's what we're going to look at with Insights. So let's take a quick look at Insights, shall we? This is where you start with Insights. And I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create a new workbook. Think of a workbook as sort of the container for your analytics. Things are organized in Insights a little bit hierarchically. You have a workbook, That's sort of the overall catch-all, the overall container for your different analytics that go together. But then you see this up here that says add to page. You have pages that are multiple pages in a workbook where you can do specific analysis. So I'm going to start off by adding some data. I could add just data from an Excel spreadsheet or a CSV. In this case, I'm going to add data that's already been incorporated, that's been uploaded and shared in my organization. It could be mine, it could be stuff that I can access through groups that I'm a part of. In this case, I'm just going to search for ILINet data that has been added to my organization. So ILINet data is the influenza-like illness network. It is a surveillance network that's managed, maintained by CDC. Given the time of year, it seemed appropriate. I hope you've all gotten your flu shots. So I have automatically added that data, or I should say Insights has automatically added that data to a map. The reason for that is it is automatically geo-enabled. It understands location automatically through this data type. You see a lot of different icons here. What this means is I am, first of all, directly connected to my data, and as it's been brought in, it's been classified semantically. So we see our location fields, we see our text fields, we see our numeric fields. If we wanted to, we could potentially change that data type. We see date fields. It's actually already been also broken down into some pretty standard types of date of different date and time fields or date and time breaks. So let's go ahead and let's do a little bit of that data prep that we talked about. I'm going to just rename this to something a little less databasey. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to rename a field too while I'm at it, because region is just not as straightforward as state. While I'm at this sort of simplifying stage, I've got a couple of fields in here that I'm just not going to use. So I'm going to go ahead and hide those. All right. So we've already started to do a little bit. I also want to, however, do a little bit of filtering. If you look at the map, not for no reason other than to be able to simplify the map and to be able to show the functionality, I'm going to filter out a couple of states. I'm actually going to stick with just the continental US. So I'm filtering, you notice that, and it is applied to the map. Now we're working with just the continental US. Because I filtered over here in the data pane, this is going to propagate throughout that page. So anything that I put in, any kind of card, and these cards are these unique, specific bits of analytic and visual functionality, that filter is going to propagate through all of those in this page. However, I could also filter right on that card if I wanted to, and then it would be specific to that card. So I've mentioned card. Why don't I go ahead and just clean a few of these up? I'm going to rename this. This is going to be more of a national overview. And up here, I'm going to just click and rename this as well. So, all right. So I've done some initial cleaning of my data. Now let's get to work on the map. So first I'm going to just zoom in. And I've got a relatively simple data set. And the one thing I have a little bit of worry about is this base map. It's a great base map, but it kind of takes away from that simple data. So I want to use a base map that's really just more of a canvas. So the highlight or the focus is really on that data that I'm working with. The other thing is, looking at that map, you would never know that you're looking at close to 1,200 points, because what we're looking at is actually weekly data for, in this case, 48 states and one district, District of Columbia, for a number of weeks, 24 weeks, I believe. So I want to be able to show that. The first thing I could, if I wanted to, I could simply, do something like a heat map. But in this case, what I actually want to do is I want to symbolize a little differently. I have something called an activity level. And what that does is it actually qualifies, we'll say, the activity of flu-like illness in a given week. So basically, by using this with that field by using this counts and amounts, the bigger the circle, the more activity there was in a given state. I could go in and change a couple things if I wanted to, just to make sure that those different circles stand out. So you could do all kinds of different things with this map. I, however, am going to leave it here for now, and I'm going to move on to some of the other types of cards. So my first inclination, and I will not try to pretend otherwise, I am not an epidemiologist. So, there may be some grains of salt required with some of these workflows, but my first inclination looking at outbreak data is to start to think about how is it spreading? What is the intensity over time? So I want to create an epi curve. The first thing I'm going to do is just pull that time field over into a new time series card. Not exactly the most useful epi curve though, because what it's showing in the y-axis right now is just the count of measurements. So basically 49 for every time frame. But I can point it instead to that activity level, and that looks a lot more like a traditional epi curve. So I can see at the apex, but even still, this is not necessarily as effective as I would like it to be, because my activity level is based on a scale of 1 to 10. And right now I'm doing a sum. So instead I'm going to change the statistic to an average. So now I can see that at the apex, the national activity level average was 9.2, pretty severe, which we all know last year was a pretty severe flu season. But you can absolutely trace the outbreak. So we've got this sort of single national view, but I also want to be able to look at it on a state-by-state level and see how the outbreak was changing over time. So I've got a state parameter, or a state field, but what I'm lacking is a single label to be able to define the week. I've got the year, I've got the week, but these are actually, based on calendar weeks, so it's a little difficult to use for labeling purposes. But what I can do is I can actually look at the underlying data table, and I can create a new field. So I'm going to go all the way to the end here. Here's our activity level field that we've been using, and I can create a new field. I'm going to relabel it, and I'm going to calculate it. So in this case, really all I want to do, even though I have a lot of functions I could use for more sophisticated formulas, all I really want to do is say year, a little text in there, plus week. I've got my little green check mark saying I'm okay to go, and I'm going to run it. So what that's done is created I missed a space, but what it's done is created a labeling field that now I can use. So I can start to say things like, all right, well, how do I want to look at the state and week? I can drag and drop in here and create some different kinds of charts. I'm going to create a heat chart. Again, by default, not showing a lot, but look at what happens when I drag and drop the activity level over. Now, I actually want to change how this is shown, because to me it's a little more intuitive if I'm seeing the states along the top and the weeks down the X or the Y axis. But what you can quickly see, you can see things like, Montana didn't have that bad of an outbreak. Nevada, you can really see that not too bad, getting worse, starting to level out a little bit. And you can see that different pattern throughout the states. So you may have caught a hint here and there of some interactivity, but I wanted to show you really quickly. Let's say I choose that apex. Everything is interconnected. Not surprising given the type of tool this is, but I actually have some differences, or I want things to behave a little differently. So I'm at the apex, I'm seeing the biggest points on the map, or the biggest symbols. Let's go to one of the others. So now I'm looking at the smallest ones. Well, I can see in this case that on the map, I've simply selected the points, and that could be fine. But what happens in the reverse? Let's say I select Arizona. That's not really giving me a sense for what the epi curve looks like in Arizona. So instead what I can do is, instead of choosing to use that interactivity as a selection, sort of a temporary focus, I can actually filter. So what this is doing is it's actually redrawing, recalculating the epi curve specific to Arizona, specific to what's been selected. I'm going to set the same function, the same capability on the map. So now if I choose a point in time, now those are the only features that are selected on the map. I personally prefer to keep the selection on the bottom so that you see the overall view, but you see it selected within. So I'm going to leave it like this. So I've got 2 cross filters set, but I'm leaving my default selection behavior down here. All right, so at the end of the day, the goal for this report is I want to be able to release it. Maybe it's to the public, maybe it's to a stakeholder. But with that in mind, I want to provide as much functionality as is appropriate. So one thing that I think at least an end user would want to be able to do would be to be able to select by state without having to go in and maybe manually select. So I can start to do things like provide predefined filters. Let's move this up so it's a little more visible. So with a predefined filter, I can go in and I could rename this, but in the interest of time, I'm going to leave it. I can go in and I can choose a state, or choose a field. In this case, I've chosen state. Notice that filter that we set early on is propagated here as well. So we won't see Alaska, we won't see Hawaii, and I can go ahead and I can add those. So now I have the ability to go ahead and just choose a state. I'm going to save this, and I'm going to show you how you can then get that information out to those end users. So if I click on this little drop down, you see I've got some options to share. In a minute, we'll take a look at the sharing as a model, but let's just go ahead and share as a page, or share the page. And I'm going to choose to make this public. So any of you who can type really quickly, you too will be able to see this until I remove it. So what this is doing is it's actually generating a URL. And if I go to that URL, my page, my Insights page is available. So I can go in, and somebody who is just on the internet can go through and can do all of these same kinds of things. So let's go back and look now at that model. So you saw that share as model. What does that even mean? In that sort of circle of functionality, one of the things that was mentioned was that you can record and repeat your workflows. And that's where this modeling pane comes in. So what you're looking at is a self-documenting workflow. This was recorded. These are the steps that we just went through to create that report. So what this means is in a year's time, in a month's time, what have you, you could come in and you could rerun the same report on newer data. It means you could share it with another analyst. It means that you've got a level of consistency. If you are doing the same type of process over and over again, if you're like me, I'm not very good at writing down the steps of how I did something. So the next time I have to do the same thing, I'm wondering, well, what did I do last time? It kind of covers you on that. So that's our quick view. Let's jump back into the presentation and review a little bit of what you saw. So the first thing I will mention is you probably saw me doing a lot of dragging and dropping. So that came into play when it was data, whether it was analysis, whether it was visualization. So let's take a look back at that data component. The first thing you probably noticed, or maybe you didn't, was I was connecting directly to data. So you noticed that you could connect to Excel, CSVs, ArcGIS content. We'll look at it a little bit later. Some of that includes Living Atlas. So that is Esri's curated set of data. We work with either data that we we have or data that we help our customers, our authoritative customers, work through to make sure that it's really well vetted and it's made available to the entire ArcGIS community. Part of that is boundaries. One thing you didn't see, and this is very much dependent on how Insights is implemented. If Insights is implemented on your own infrastructure, you might also see an option there to connect directly to a database. So that could be SQL Server, Oracle, SAP HANA. Once you've connected to that data, then you have this semantically classified data. So you see all the fields. You have the ability to update all the fields. We didn't go into a lot of it, but you also have these visual cues to help you understand how to interpret or how to organize those data sets. Because you can imagine, we did a very simple report. There are going to be times where you have a data set, you bring in another data set, you run an analysis, that leads you to another analysis, and blah, 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 and it continues. So you can imagine that you could be in situations where you have a lot of data in that data pane. So some of the things to help you figure out really quickly where a data set came from and what it's related to, those black and white icons, those show original data sets. The orange with the little arrow, that means it's it's a result. If you see a blue bar that connects two data sets, two or more data sets, that means they're related. And there are also lines between any hierarchical data sets and results. We looked at a little bit of the data prep capabilities or just general data understanding capabilities. So we went ahead and we renamed a few things. We also looked at how you could change values. So what's kind of interesting is if you are to change the value or the data type, for a field, some of the default capabilities change. So what you're seeing right now is population density. Well, that's by default just a standard number. However, and over on the map that's related, you see it's sort of that size graded dot, those size graded points. But if you change it to a ratio, by default it symbolizes differently. And that's just sort of a kind of default QA/QC behavior that you get with Insights. We also didn't spend a whole lot of time, but down at the bottom you also see that you have the ability to use and manage pop-ups. So what actually gets exposed when you hover, when you click on a dot on the map, or a point on the map, or a polygon. So some of the other things that you saw happening, creating, and this is, think back to that pure drag and drop behavior. We were creating different cards being those unique, those separate pieces of visualization and analytic capabilities. You can update cards as well. We'll look at that in a little bit. And you'll also notice that in this case, the list of available cards, the list of available charts, tables, that kind of thing, it's different in each situation. These are context-driven. So depending on the type of data you're trying to use, you're going to be presented with the appropriate list of cards based on what's possible with that data. You can also actually do some spatial analysis directly by drag and dropping. So if you have a layer on the map and you drag another one on, yeah, you can add it just as a layer, but you also have the ability to do certain spatial analytics. And this is, we'll look at this in a little bit. Describing it's a little bit tough. It's a lot easier to see, but we talked during the demo about the idea of selections versus filters. So if you select something, it could be using the selection tools on the map. It could be by clicking on it on the legend. You can then drag and drop that selection into a new card. So selections, sort of that temporary, that temporary highlighting of features, versus filters where you're actually filtering for what's available, what's visible, what's not. And there are some different scopes involved in that. So let's get into a little bit more of the meat of the analysis and what differentiates Insights. It's really this ability to work beyond the tabular, to be able to pull spatial in inherently. So that falls into a couple of different things when we're talking about these tables, and I'll just take a quick sidebar just to mention there are two different kinds of tables in Insights. We saw one already. We worked in the data table. This is where it is actually the underlying data. This is where you can add fields, where you can calculate new fields or calculate those fields with different formulas. There is also a table card, and this is effectively, it's a summary table, it's a pivot table. So you can start to incorporate those into your reports as well. So enabling that location, or enabling location within your tabular data. There's a few different ways to do this. I suspect the most simple is to, if you have that data, to simply map an X and a Y coordinate. You have a latitude and a longitude, or what have you. What I think is what is more typical, especially in health and human services, is to either geocode addresses. So you have address information for a facility, or what have you. Maybe it's a patient or a constituent. You can actually map those to the world, to the globe, and that is in effect joining. It is a lookup. You also have the ability to join to known geographies. So if you have a need to join to zip codes in the United States, you can do that. You can add that to your page, and then you can use that as the basis for how you're joining your tabular data to geography. This oftentimes is where Living Atlas comes in, because, well, boundary data, while it's really important, it's not necessarily, especially having it updated and maintained, is not necessarily central to most people's mission. So being able to use Living Atlas boundaries, whether it's the US, whether it's any number of other countries, to know that it's updated frequently, regularly, and that it is pervasive throughout the world. I think yesterday I checked and found 70 boundaries for 70 different countries or administrative areas. So to be able to use that and know that it's coming from a trusted source is pretty valuable. You can also, however, create traditional relationships, so join your data. Maybe you have a field in common between two of your data sets. You can join. Some of the standard kinds of ways that you would expect to. You can intersect them. That's what the inner is. You can do a union. That's where that all comes in, or left or right. You can also join shapes. So if you have a service area and you have a bunch of patients, or we'll see an example later where maybe you have school districts and you want to be able to intersect all of the schools and join them, you can do that. Intersect is the default, or is the relationship type when you do join shape fields, though. Then we start to move into more of the analytics. So we have seen a small portion of the available cards in Insights. And to be honest, in an hour, we will only see a small portion of the available cards for Insights because the list is pretty long. But just in general, think about the types of things that it can do, that it can show. Are they quantities, like measures? Let's see, are they showing relationships? Maybe it's a scatter plot that you want to be able to show the relationship between two fields. Do you want to be able to do like the epicurve and show change? Or do you want to be able to show interaction? We're going to look in a few minutes at how spider diagrams can show movement from one location to another. You might want to be able to do a heat map to show distribution. Or you might want to be able to just show proportions, and we'll take a look at that a little bit later as well. At the end of the day, one of the things, though, that is important regardless of how you're doing your analysis is to be able to feel confident in the quality of your analysis. So there are everything from actual statistical analyses to just showing statistical measures. So we looked at the simplest of these being a feature count. We saw that there were 1,200, almost 1,200 points on that map. But that might change where if you are looking at a column chart, you may want to be able to see some things like the mean or the distribution. If you're looking at A scatter plot, you might want to be able to look at the trend. Maybe it's logarithmic, maybe it's linear. You may want to be able to do a regression analysis and look at the R-square. So in this case, regression analysis is an ordinary least squares. One of the things that is incredibly valuable, and I admit to forgetting about it as much as anyone, is this ability to record and repeat your workflows. So, you know, whether it is being able to go in and just see what you did, whether it's going in and really digging in on what did I do, what did I set when I did that aggregation, whether it's being able to go in and update the data to be able to run an accessibility analysis quarterly and make sure that you follow the same steps each time. This is really crucial to be able to do that. Or whether it's sharing it to be able to make sure that the model that you create is available to other analysts in your organization. So that's really where the sharing comes in, is what you share and how you share it really depends on who needs to use it. We saw two variations on it. We saw sharing the page, the idea there being, okay, well, if you have somebody who needs to be able to use it from a reporting capability, you're going to want to be able to share that page, and then they can access it in the browser. However, if you want to share with another analyst, you may want to share the model. If you're working with someone else on your team, they might need to be able to open your entire workbook with all of the pages, and you can start to enable that. Or one other thing, or you can actually share the data itself. So if you run an analysis and there is new derivative data, you may want to be able to share that, and then someone else might want to put that in another type of web app. They might want to put it into a story map. So just the idea that you share at different levels, different types of entities, and it very much is dependent on who needs that end product. All right, let's look in a little more detail at some of the analytics. So I mentioned, well, we ended at the model. What happens if we add another page, and in this case we actually start with a model? So I have this school outreach model. The idea being here, I have this set, I'm calling it a template model. That's sort of the starting point. And I want to use it to be able to understand one of my high-risk flu populations, kids, and how do I outreach to their parents? Maybe it's about getting them vaccinated. Maybe it's about ensuring they remind them to wash their hands, or just making sure they understand when to keep their kids home. There are any number of different reasons, as somebody who has 2 school-age kids, why I would get information through the school district related to the flu. So if I go back to that sort of data view, I see an empty model. Yes, I see that it's going to have a map. I see that it's going to have something else here. I can't even see what. That is because there is no data. It is a pure template in this case. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add some data. I'm going to start with those boundaries that we just talked about. I'm going to add the counties for the United States. And I have some school-related data that's been shared in my organization that I'm going to add as well. So the schools and the school districts. So while it is being added, all right, there we go. So it's starting to come in. Now I can go ahead and I can update my model. So here are my counties. Let me point it to the new data. And we're just going to go through that in a couple of different tacts, point that to the new schools and to the new districts. And while that's running, let's just take a look at what it's doing. So the counties are the counties for the entire United States. But I don't want to deal with all of the counties for the United States. I just want a single county, Dallas County in Texas. That's the focus of my analysis. So once I've filtered that, the county, I can then filter the schools, which are the schools for all of Texas, to again just have the schools for Dallas County. Then what's going to happen is it's going to aggregate the schools to the districts. And then we're going to do some styling. So while that continues to run, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do a little bit of cleanup over here, because you guys probably noticed when you add spatial data, it automatically is added to a map. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to clean up those maps. Oh, and there we go. So while we were doing that, the rest of the analysis finished up. And what I can see is I've got a heat map that is centered or is over Dallas County in Texas. Let's just take a look at the different data sets that we have. So we have that trimmed county. This is the filtered county. So instead of having all of the counties for the U.S., we just have that single one. On top of it, we have the aggregated schools. So these are the different school districts, and I can see how many schools are in each school district, and they're color-coded. Just a different way of symbolizing it. Same thing. In this case, we're looking at the centroids for the school districts, and the size of the dot, the size of the point, is based on how many schools are there. And also to give you an idea of the distribution of the schools, there's also a heat map that's being created. So I'm going to turn this off, and I'm going to actually move that centroid above. And if I wanted to, for instance, see where Garland was, where the Garland Independent School District with 84 schools was, and so on and so forth. But what I really want to do is, now that I understand, in this case I see by the size of the bubble that Dallas has the highest number of schools. It's great. I know now, or at least I have the beginnings of a plan for how to prioritize, but I also want to understand more about the folks who live in these school districts, because at the end of the day, I want to be able to cater a message to them as well. And that is where being able to enrich with Esri's data comes into play. So I don't want to enrich the county. I want to enrich the school district, so that count of Dallas County schools. And I'm looking at global. Just like the boundaries, we have data for any number of different countries. I, today, am interested in the United States. And I recommend going through, you can go onto our site and you can explore all the data variables that are there. Again, in the interest of time, I am going to go ahead and pick one variable that I'm interested in. If you've been on our previous webinars, you've seen this idea of tapestry. Tapestry is Esri's system that we use to classify the population. It's based on demographics, it's based on behavior, it's based on any number of different things. It came up more quickly than I was expecting. So what I now have is I have this new, again, data set. We see up there the bars and the lines that are connecting for hierarchy. If I take this dominant tapestry, I can now pull it over. We'll create a donut chart, and I can see proportions of the overall population, and based on the school districts, which ones fall into which category. So if I go ahead and I pick Dallas, then I see that the dominant tapestry there is Metro Renters. It's the only school district that has that as the dominant tapestry. If I look at it, I can see pretty quickly these are probably not the folks that I'm focused on. Relatively low household size, relatively low age. This is dominantly single folks. Not always, but dominantly single folks. So I might want to go back to my data and say, all right, well, that's great. What's the highest proportion? In this case, it's American Dreamers. And there are 3 school districts where this is the dominant tapestry. So if I look at American Dreamers, I see, just based on the picture on the front, that it's probably a different type of demographic. In this case, we're looking at a little bit higher or a little bigger household size. We see younger married couples with children, often grandparents. I see information about diversity, oftentimes of Hispanic origin, but I can also get some information about how they behave. If I'm trying to target outreach, what are the channels that might be effective? So in this case, they like smartphones. They use the internet quite a bit. I can go down a little bit further and dig into more detail and see where they like to eat, see what TV they like to watch, see what kind of radio they listen to. So I get a lot of information about how I might want to target. Now, that doesn't mean that this is the end of the story. What this tells me is, okay, I've got 3 where American Dreamers is the dominant tapestry, but that's just the dominant one. It doesn't mean the entire population falls into that category. What this is going to do, which I personally feel is a sign of any good analytic technology, is it leads me to ask more questions. And if we had time, what I would probably do from here is I would probably enrich with more variables. Maybe I'd get into some of the fine-grained ones about social media usage, or maybe I'd enrich every one of the school districts to see what the number or percentage of the population is that falls into American Dreamers. Then I can figure out if I can apply that same strategy to more than just these three school districts. But the idea is, how can you ask a question, answer it, and then keep asking those questions and keep iterating? So I want to go through one more, create one more page to show a little bit more of the spatial function, the spatial analysis functionality. And in this case, we're going to look at another at-risk population when it comes to the flu, the elderly and disabled. So to proxy that, or to go down that path, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at assisted living facilities in Dallas County. And what I want to understand is, how is my hospital system, or how are the hospitals in the area positioned to be able to handle a potential influx if I have an epidemic at these that is really focused on these assisted living facilities? So I see right away I've got two spatial data sets that have been pulled into play. One of them is this assisted living reports. I've got, yes, spatial data, but I don't have much else. So I'm actually going to pull this one out, which removes the map, because in this other assisted living reports, I have a lot more information, and I also have the address data. So what I can do is I can say enable location, and I can geocode it. So it's picked up the fields based on the field names. I'm going to run it. In this case, I'm running it against a cloud-based geocoder. And we will talk a little bit more about security implications in a moment. But in this case, these are facilities. This is fine. There's no protected health information. So I'm going to make this a little bigger. And what I want to do is I want to pull that newly spatially enabled data set onto the map. But I want to symbolize it by the number of clients. Now you probably saw, I'm going to do that. I had the ability to do some spatial analysis with the drag and drop. In this case, I just added it as a new layer. But I'm going to zoom in, and you see, just like that first ILINet data set that we looked at, it's been automatically, in this case, because it was based on a number field, symbolized with that gradational sizing. So, okay, I can start to see to a certain extent where more clients are, where there are less. I can see where the hospitals are. I'm going to move the hospitals on top. But I really want to understand access in this case. So we've already gone in and looked at the spatial analysis tools, but I might not know which tool I want to use. So I can start to take a different approach and really think about the kind of questions that I want to answer. Do I want to ask about how it's distributed? Not in this case. As really cool as it would be to do a regression model, in this case it's not really appropriate. Here I want to understand what's nearby, and I want to find what is the hospital, the nearest hospital to each of those assisted living facilities. So what this is doing is it's actually going out and it's calculating what the nearest hospital is, and we've got our spider diagram. I'm going to go ahead and just symbolize these by the distance that was calculated. So I can see right away by the thickness of some of these lines and the length of them that some assisted living facilities have quite a ways to go to be able to get to the nearest hospital. But the actual access in terms of time and miles, that's only one part of the equation. So I might want to be able to see, for instance, how many are not near with a quick histogram. Let's make this a little bit bigger. So I can see right away, all right, for the most part, most of them are pretty good within 2-3 miles, but I do have these outliers here, so I can see on the map where those are. But I also want to be able to start to understand, all right, well, by hospital, how many folks from assisted living would I expect to show up or to have to go there, or do I have to plan around? So I'm going to go back to my handy dandy bubble chart because I can see quickly which hospitals have the highest number of patients. So one thing I need to do if I were doing this in a production, for a real analysis, is I'd probably want to be a little pickier about the hospitals I choose and do a better job of filtering, because I doubt very highly that you're going to be sending over 1,000 assisted living clients to a surgery hospital. But the idea being the same, 812 people could, in an absolute worst case scenario, end up at Dallas Regional Medical Center based on their nearest hospital. Well, can the hospital even manage that kind of surge? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the beds available against that total number and create one of those summary tables that we talked about. Just give it a little bit more space. So if I look at hospitals that have a lot of clients potentially going there, there are 416 beds. So I can start to see potential inadequacies. Now, granted, this is very much a beyond worst case scenario, but the idea of the methodologies being the same. I may also want to, however, look at this visually. So back to that contextual, well, what other options do I have? Let's take a look at it in a tree map. So in this case, each box represents one of the hospitals. The size of the box represents how many beds are available. The color represents how many folks could end up, if 100% of the clients were sick and hospitalized, could end up at that facility. So what we're looking for are areas that have, or facilities that have small boxes and dark colors, like Methodist. So again, grain of salt with the actual stories, but the idea being that the technologies are there, the processes are there. So let's head back to our presentation and wrap things up a little bit. So if we think about what we just saw, you saw different examples of bringing in different types of data, but that consistent approach of I can ask questions, I can answer them, and I can just keep asking more and more questions. And we did see that example of, well, then what do you do with that once you've done it? I am a big proponent of thinking through how you present your data, because at the end, your results, because at the end of the day, if it isn't accessible and usable by the people who are making decisions, what was the point of doing the analysis if it doesn't lead to something? So the ability to show your work in an intuitive way. And now, especially since this is the third webinar from this series, I thought maybe we'd end with taking a step back and thinking about where this actually fits into the broader scheme of things. So ArcGIS has a lot of apps. Any of you who've been exposed to ArcGIS recently know we have a lot of apps. They are geared at different types of functionality, different types of user needs. They generally fall into one of a few different categories. We've got things geared at field work. So maybe you're collecting data in the field, or you're assigning work, or you're just navigating out in the field. You will see that all of the apps that we focused on in this particular series of webinars falls into the office category. Insights is there, Pro, which you'll see next month, and Community Analyst. These are all apps that are geared at analysis and work in the office kind of thing. We could spend a ton of different webinars going over community-facing apps, story maps, open data in the hub to really engage with your stakeholders, making configurable apps, or just pulling specific apps that are geared at your solution. What I do ask you all to do, though, is please go to storymaps.esri.com. In the gallery, you're going to see amazing examples of stories that have been created by users of ArcGIS as well as Esri staff, you're not only going to see an amazing spread, an amazing spectrum of stories, but even just different ways to configure those story maps. And the configuration part is why story maps also falls under the builder category, because these series, these set of apps, the idea is you can pull apps together with no programming required. So whether you're building a web app to create things for the browser, or whether you're creating apps for a phone using, you know, a native app for your iPhone with App Studio, that's under that builders category. And all of those apps are implemented in one of a few different ways. The two really they fall into this one of these categories. Today you saw completely ArcGIS Online. That is Esri's SaaS cloud offering. It is great for a lot of things. We have a lot of public health and even private health organizations using it, and the apps, you know, being implemented on top of that. However, what we also see in health and human services, because of just the security requirements around the data, is that most organizations are going to implement almost like their own version of ArcGIS Online, but in their own infrastructure. The reason being, ArcGIS Online is not HIPAA compliant, but you can manage to not have to worry about that sharing if you've pulled everything in and implemented it behind your firewall using ArcGIS Enterprise. So before we go to Q&A, I do want to let you know that there are resources available for you to learn more about this. I realize this was a lot in less than an hour, but in addition to the things like blogs and videos and articles, there are free tutorials that you can start to do. You can evaluate insights for ArcGIS, so you can, you know, get access to it for an evaluation period, and you can start to do some of these tutorials, or you can take training. Web courses are available. If you're on maintenance, they are free to you, but there are also instructor-led courses. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Natalie for questions.
Thanks, Tanya. So we do have quite a few questions that came in. So one of them I would like to ask is, does Insights work in ArcGIS Portal?
It does. So Portal for ArcGIS is part of ArcGIS Enterprise. So the idea is you would access it from Portal for ArcGIS, and you would get that same look and feel and experience as if you are accessing it through ArcGIS Online, just behind your firewall and secure.
Great. Okay. So can you please explain the idea of sharing to a group?
Absolutely. Let me pull something up and actually show something. So one thing that you've probably noticed throughout the various seminars that we've done recently is this idea of identity, that you have an identity within ArcGIS. Groups follow on that same idea. So if I have anything in ArcGIS, whether it's an insights report or what have you, I can go in, this is the hospitals in Texas data set that we just looked at, and I can choose how to share it. So I can not share it at all. I can share it with everybody in ArcGIS Online. That means literally everybody with a browser. I can share it within the other folks that are part of my organization, or I can share it within groups. And the idea is you can create groups. For all kinds of different things, whether it's project specific, maybe it's for a group, like a division or a department, but the idea is you would have like people that are working on similar work or have similar interests that you can actually share into those defined groups, and only those people can easily find that data or that content.
Great, thank you. Another question, you had mentioned that there was data from other countries. Mm-hmm. How can I find out which country's boundaries are in the Living Atlas, and where does that data come from?
All right, so it's going to vary depending on the country to a certain extent, But what I would recommend is if you go to Esri demographics, and if you just look that up, you'll come to the site that actually allows you to go in and explore a few different things. It gives you access, I had mentioned later, even with the enrichment, you should really go in and explore that. There is a data explorer where you can go in and see which variables are available. It also talks about methodologies, and it talks about where the sourcing came from. So I would say go in and look at Esri demographics, go in and look at Esri's Living Atlas content on the web, and you'll find all the answers to all of your questions and probably more.
Awesome. Okay, let me see here. I'm going to go with one more question because I know there's quite a few coming in. You mentioned that protected health information shouldn't be shared on ArcGIS Online because it's not HIPAA compliant. Does it meet any security protocols?
So there's, yes. For full information on it, I'll send you to another website. Trust.arcgis.com goes through all of our security and compliance information. It's definitely a handy thing to look at if you have questions about that. The short answer, though, is that ArcGIS Online, amongst other things, the one that stands out most is FedRAMP Low. So if you even need to go up to FedRAMP Moderate, I believe it is, we do have a hosted infrastructure that we can do where Esri actually will host ArcGIS Enterprise for you, and we'll put some fail-safes in related to that, and that is listed as FedRAMP, or can be listed as FedRAMP Moderate, but ArcGIS Online is FedRAMP Low.
All right, great. Well, I'm going to go ahead and we're going to go ahead and end the webinar, the meetup. I appreciate you all attending. We will have a recording that will be sent out next week. And thank you all for your questions, and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.